So in this segment, I'm pretty late to this one, but I thought it might be worth discussing. So we're going to talk about the UK and the quote Swiss style agreement, which we're not going to get. I've heard some people again talk about how the only barrier to us getting back into the single market is the UK accepting freedom of movement. I mean, that's a joke, but even then, they won't put in the work to kind of explain to people why freedom of movement is generally a good thing. And the fact is, the Labour government or the Labour Party are against freedom of movement, anyways. But this is far more egregious than any of that stuff that what the Conservative Party have come out with. So this first bit makes perfect sense as to what Jeremy Hunt said, which is very rare. I'll give Jeremy Hunt any credit. I'm saying that with a H before YouTube demonetizes me. So, asked by Michel, who works for the BBC, if rejoining the single market would boost growth, Jeremy Hunt said, having unfettered trade with our neighbours is very beneficial to growth, have great confidence over the years ahead outside the single market, able to remove the vast majority of trade barriers between us and the EU. And that's weird given that he's gone with a constant statement of deregulation and divergence from the EU. Somehow he suggests that we will remove the trade barriers or more trade barriers with the EU. I don't know how he's going to achieve that. He's going to have to square the circle. Suggests at margin difference approach to at least try to lower some of the non-tariff barriers that have arisen as a result of Johnson and Frost's deal, even though Boris Johnson claimed very famously there are no non-tariff barriers to trade with the EU. Absolute joke. Unfettered trade with the EU was quietly dropped as the name of EU negotiations when Johnson became Prime Minister, even if Johnson erroneously claimed he meant no non-tariff barriers, which he kind of won. He kind of pushed that in the election, and he was like, oh, actually, that's not the case. Sounds like he thinks it's inevitable for Germany, for us to kind of join towards being better trading partners with Germany and France, negotiate mutual lowering of standards, because the idea of the UK is this, right? This is the key. In a private senior meeting, sources have suggested that pursuing frictionless trade requires moving towards a Swiss-style relationship over the next decade. However, they insist they would not extend freedom of movement. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, the EU is built on four major pillars. It's free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And so somehow we're going to get even better deal than the Swiss or anyone else, because obviously we're xenophobic. We don't want freedom of movement, but we like free movement of goods, capital, and services, right? So this person here, this unnamed source, right, saying it's obviously something the EU would never offer us up front, because they would say you're trying to have your cake and eat it, and they wouldn't be wrong. But the reason I think we'll get it is it's overwhelmingly in the business interests on both sides, one said. And the problem is they don't get the EU because it's more than just a project for money, in the sense of if the EU just wanted to be rich, right, if EU member states just wanted to be purely rich, they wouldn't have included so many former Soviet Union kind of countries that were kind of taken over by Stalin, right? They wouldn't have countries like Poland or the Baltics, etc., because these are still developing countries. If they wanted to be proper rich, they would just have a load of developed nations that trade with each other, and they would just, maybe they'd have freer movement for people from other parts of Europe. They wouldn't be trying to get countries like Serbia in, for example. So this idea that the EU would compromise just for financial gain is ridiculous. And also, if the EU were about money over morals for the whole part of it, I'm not saying the EU is some sort of moral bastion here, they wouldn't put so many sanctions on Russia, given how dependent the Eurozone are for trade with Russia when it comes to gas, oil, amongst other things. So this idea that the EU will cave to us because it benefits EU businesses, the EU haven't lost us as a trading partner, not fundamentally. Exports have kind of not struggled so much, but the issue is that a lot of the smaller traders from the EU have struggled to export to the UK. But the thing is, our checks at the border are far less stringent than the EU's checks at the border, which I think we'll talk about in a week or so, because there's a funny article I found about a ferry company boss complaining about EU checks. But the fact is, our checks are less aggressive than the EU's ones, which makes it cheaper for them to export to us than it is for us to export to them. So, they argue Switzerland has access to the European single market through a series of bilateral agreements. However, the model also involves more liberal EU migration, payments to the EU budget, which the bloc in recent years is also pushing for the European Court of Justice to have greater oversight in the relationship. The Swiss have frequently debated restricting freedom of movement, but have kept it in place. So the argument that they would somehow give us this stuff, and also we may or may not have to contribute to the EU budget, I don't see the EU biting on that. Now, Jeremy Hunt has refused to deny. He briefed that the government wants Swiss-style ties with the EU, which is quite interesting. He refused to deny it, which kind of implies he could be the source, or maybe someone in his department is the source, because again, the Sunday Times, they do really good work and they do have great sources. But according to Ava Centina, Hunt denies being the source on it, but says in context of people saying Brexit trade barriers are a cause of our problems, technology will be the solution. So again, he's talking absolute drivel once again. Back to classic Jeremy Hunt here, because technology won't solve it. There aren't any borders. Even the EU's border with Norway, for example, they don't rely just solely on technology. There are physical inspections and things like that, but they do have a really cool X-ray machine. So this is ridiculous. You've got Richard Tice and Nigel Farage saying, we have done it before, we'll do it again. If the Tories betray Brexit, we'll obliterate them. If the Tories go for a Swiss-style deal, which means freedom of movement and alignment to the EU, they will be obliterated. So you've got Big Nigel stepping out, talking about, a big comeback. But I guess you can't call it a comeback because he's been here for years. Number 10 seeks to quell hardline Brexiteers over reports of a Swiss-style deal. It could be kite flying. That's what I've seen a lot of the other commentators say. My issue is this: if it is kite flying, it might be the degree to which we go for kind of EU alignment and equivalency agreements, or rather than a Swiss-style agreement. But the EU have pointed out. I don't have the article in front of me, but the EU have pointed out here that what do you call it? It's the London negotiating with itself, which is very true. It is a case of the UK negotiating with itself of how far can we go in terms of EU alignment or equivalency, and trying to get bilateral agreements rather than us negotiating with them, because we still haven't figured out what Brexit's about. We still don't have a fundamental ideology. Because Rishi Sunak, went on to say, under his leadership, the United Kingdom will not pursue any relationship with the EU. I believe in Brexit. I believe Brexit is already delivering enormous benefit and opportunities. We have proper control over our borders. Yeah, you keep moaning about channel crossing, so where's the control there? Also, the fact that freedom of movement does get demonised a lot, so I thought it'd be worth pointing out just in this video. I'll do it in the Labour one as well, which I'm going to do soon. It's going to come out probably a day or two after this one, which is what's the link between membership of the single market and lower wages, claimed by Big Ticey, saying membership of the single market has led to wage suppression over the last 12 years, and Full Fact have said we haven't seen evidence to prove that membership of the single market suppressed wages in the last 12 years. Now, this article came out in 2017, but for the most part, 7 years would have been under Tory rule, so I wonder how much of that is linked to wage suppression. Some of that would have been the Great Recession as well, but the Tories were in charge for 7 of those 12 years approximately, so his point, I think, is a bit nonsensical in that respect. It might be a bit of cherry picking of statistics here, because we've had free movement for a while. I think a lot of the kind of Eastern European countries were added to freedom of movement, or had access to freedom of movement since I think 2002, 2004. So the numbers don't fully stack up in Tyce's favour, but when did Brexiteers ever care about maths, huh? But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.